Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first Sulgrave seminar of the 2024-25 season. My name is Dr. Sam Edwards, and I'm a historian at Loughborough University, but I'm speaking to you this evening in a different role as a trustee at Sulgrave Manor, the ancestral home in Northamptonshire of George Washington, first President of the United States, and the original home of the US-UK Special Relationship. Each year, we at Sulgrave endeavour to deliver for you a number of live and online seminars involving leading experts sharing their knowledge and wisdom about matters of interest to you, our transatlantic community. Last year, our seminars explored the subject of democracy, and we had speakers talk to us about such things as the connections and contrasts between the US and UK constitutions, the electoral process on both sides of the Atlantic, and the differences in presidential versus prime ministerial leadership. This year, our theme is that of alliances, an important subject given last year's 75th anniversary of NATO and this year's 80th anniversary of victory in Europe. And where better to start than with a talk about a historical figure so central to the establishment of that victorious wartime Grand Alliance, and a man who did so much to popularise the very idea of a US-UK special relationship, and I'm referring, of course, to Winston Churchill. I'm delighted to introduce, therefore, our speaker, Katherine Carter. Katherine is a historian, curator at Chartwell, the former home in Kent of Winston Churchill, and author of the critically acclaimed Churchill Citadel. Churchill Citadel was published last September by Yale University Press and has quickly met with widespread praise and acclaim. Professor Richard Toye of the University of Exeter has called it, quote, a masterly exploration of an important phase in British political history. Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams, meanwhile, has said that Katherine tells her story of the political life of the house in the 1930s with, quote, such relish that one can smell the cigar smoke exude from every page. Katherine's going to talk to us now for about 40 minutes, and at the end of that, we've got some time. She's very kindly agreed to take some questions from yourselves. So jot down those questions as we talk. You can put them into the chat at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Katherine. Katherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you everyone for joining this evening as it is currently here in Surrey in the UK. I'm very aware that I was originally hoping to speak to this group at the tail end of last year in December, and unfortunately was unwell and unable to do so. So I thought I would start with something ever so slightly different by way of apologies for not being able to join you last time, and thank you for having me back early this year. So as a special treat, let me just pull up this wonderful item which is on display at Chartwell and which I thought would be particularly interesting for those of you joining this evening. This is a form of a family tree which shows one individual, Robert Kitson, from whom both George Washington and Winston Churchill are descended. So quite remarkable that there is one person in history from whom both those icons of their own national stories descend. And if you look down the left-hand side, you can see the Washingtons, and you can see reference to Sulgrave Manor in some of those earlier ones. And like I said, this is a document that was given to Winston Churchill and is on display at Chartwell. So I thought attendees this evening might appreciate the presence of Sulgrave Manor at Winston Churchill's home in Kent. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen and come back to you all. So, as has been kindly outlined by Sam, my name is Katherine Carter, and I am in my day job the curator of Winston Churchill's family home in Kent. And I've been there since 2013. So I'm in my 12th year now in that remarkable role. And not only that, I had the extraordinary pleasure of calling Chartwell my home for 6 of those years. So there is an apartment in the very rafters of the building that is allocated for a member of staff. I always hasten to add that it was far less grand than the rooms that Churchill's occupied. It's a series of rooms that were originally servants' quarters, so I certainly knew my place. But it was thanks to having not only worked there day in, day out for 12 years, but lived there as well. I felt I had an extraordinary sense of how the building worked, from the likes of knowing what every creak of the building meant, to knowing how the light varied in terms of how it cast shadows across the garden, depending on the seasons. Just those sort of really intangible understandings you can get purely from being at a place so much. the reason I decided to write a book on Chartwell to come out at the end of last year was last year had a number of special anniversaries as well. So in November, it was 150 years since the birth of Sir Winston Churchill, and also 2024 similarly marked 100 years since the Churchill family moved into Chartwell. So a very special year. And in terms of how Chartwell tends to be represented in the historiography of Winston Churchill, it's usually seen as Winston Churchill's place of respite, the place he would go to relax and paint the views and escape the pressures of life in Westminster. But I could see from the research that I was accumulating over the time that actually a far more significant element of Chartwell's importance was the role that it played in the 1930s. And there was a general reference to Winston Churchill holding meetings at his home during this time, but there'd never been an in-depth exploration of it. So I wanted to shine a spotlight on the fact that events happened at Chartwell which genuinely changed the course of history. And I have done so by looking at 12 meetings that chart those remarkable years as Europe descended towards war. But what I thought I would do for you all this evening is do a little bit of the context of what Chartwell was, how it came to be Winston Churchill's home, and then how it came to be that Winston Churchill was out of office in the early 30s and making this campaign against the Nazis. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so hopefully you can see on your screen right now, if I've managed to do the share screen function correctly. Lovely, thumbs up from Sam, much appreciated. The front cover of my book on the left and a photograph on the right. This photograph is one that I found in a family album of Winston Churchill's daughters. This is Churchill at his desk in his study, broadcasting live to the United States. You can see the NBC microphone. And this is at about midnight on a night in early August 1939. So war hasn't yet broken out. Winston Churchill is a member of Parliament. He's not in government, but such is his clout, essentially, on the subject of Nazism and the war that was looming, that he was able to broadcast it to the United States. So how did it come to be that he had this level of knowledge and authority? But first, what was Chartwell? So if I click on the next slide, lovely. So for a moment, I ask you all to forget the Second World War leader, Winston Churchill. I know that's a hard thing to forget because that's the version of Churchill that leaps to all of our minds. But I'm going to take you back to 1921. So here we have a 47-year-old politician. And this is, in fact, Winston Churchill's third career. He began as a young man, serving for Queen and country during the reign of Queen Victoria for the British Army. He then left the army and developed a career as a writer and journalist, a hugely successful and rather well-paid one, I should add, but he is, by this point, a very established parliamentarian. His parliamentary career has been something of a roller coaster. He began in the year 1900 as a member of Parliament for the Conservatives, moved across to the Liberals in 1904, and he is still with the Liberals at this point in this photograph that we're looking at, serving as their Secretary of State for the Colonies. In terms of the roles that he's had in government, again, it's been a roller coaster. He has, at the heights of his career, included roles such as Home Secretary, which is one of the great offices of state. He was then First Lord of the Admiralty at the outset of the First World War. And unfortunately, it's for this reason that the failure of a military campaign known as Gallipoli, for which he was largely blamed and had a significantly high casualty rate, saw him resign from his position in government and go to fight on the Western Front. He's returned to government, as you can see by this point. He's back in London and he is rebuilding his political reputation, but it's not where it was before the First World War. He has also married by this point. He married the beautiful and incredibly intelligent Clementine Hosier in 1908. And as a testimony to her role and her importance, Churchill once said that his life and anything he achieved had been made possible thanks to her. So you've heard it from the horse's mouth. She is incredibly important to his success. They have 4 children by this point as well. They have their 2 daughters, Diana and Sarah, you can see at the very top, their only son, Randolph, who's bottom left, and an infant called Marigold, who you can see being cradled by Clementine in the bottom right. So this is the Churchill family as they were when Winston Churchill first saw a house on a hill called Chartwell. If any of you have been to Chartwell or seen photographs of it even, you're probably looking at the one that I'm showing you on screen right now and thinking, that does not look anything like the house that I'm familiar with. And you would be absolutely right. There's been a house on the site at Chartwell since the 1300s, and none of that original building survives, but the oldest part of the building that we're looking at now, and that survives to this day, is Tudor, so dating from approximately the reign of Henry VIII. Over the following centuries, it's been owned by a succession of families, and the family who had it just before the Churchills were a Scottish family called the Campbell Cahoons, who added elements onto the building in this style you're seeing on screen. It's called Scottish baronial. It's a bit like Victorian Gothic, but with a distinctly Scottish flavour to it. And it looks rather nice on screen. Unfortunately, once you get inside, you quickly see the flaws in this building as it was in 1921. Legend had it that the matriarch of the family, when reading her newspapers in bed in the morning, used to have her umbrella up. Such was the amount of water pouring through the ceilings. So Winston Churchill sees this house and, despite its rather obvious structural failings, falls in love with it. And he commissions an architect to give his synopsis as to whether it was worth the investment. And the review that the architect gave was, unfortunately for Churchill, rather scathing. It read, "Only the kernel of the old manor, floored and raftered in old oak, had withstood the ravages of the wet. The rest was weary of its own ugliness, so that the walls ran with moisture and creeping fungus tracked down the cracks and crevices." So I think it's safe to say Winston Churchill's looking at a fixer-upper at this point. Clementine sees it at this point in 1921 as well, and initially rather likes it. She thinks it's got beautiful views from it, but she can see that it's an absolute money pit. So she decides, do you know what? It's a lovely idea, but we can't even afford the price of the house, let alone the renovations, and she quickly sours on the idea. There's also the fact that at that point their finances just weren't quite in the right place to be able to afford it. And unfortunately for the Churchills, they suffered from 4 deaths in their extended family in that one year in 1921, including, devastatingly, their youngest daughter Marigold, who we saw in that photograph a moment ago being held by Clementine. So with all of those reasons combined, Chartwell seemed like a pipe dream, but didn't seem that it was meant to be. It wasn't the right time for the Churchills to be taking on this major project, and they couldn't afford it anyway. But what Churchill does next is rather brave by anyone's standards, because a year passes and he benefits from a rather sizable inheritance. At this point, the first question he asks is Chartwell still on the market? And it is, perhaps unsurprisingly, given its condition. So Winston Churchill makes the boldest move of his marriage, waits until the day that Clementine is giving birth to their 5th child, another daughter called Mary, and makes an offer on the house without telling her for £5,000. So £500 under the 5,500 asking price. The offer is accepted, and so Chartwell becomes the Churchills. You might be wondering why, given that this house was obviously so flawed and would need so much work, Churchill fell in love with it to the extent that he did. And this is the reason. Now, I've never found a photograph that does this view justice, and I don't think I can describe it in words either to do it justice, but I'm going to give it a go for you all this evening. Chartwell sits at the top of a valley, and so what you have is this landscape that just falls away before your eyes absolutely beautifully. So in the near foreground, although you can't see it in this angle I've taken the picture from, there are lakes, there's formal gardens, but also you have this lovely rolling landscape beyond of fields and woodland. So this is the view that captured Winston Churchill's heart, but he now had a very costly house in urgent need of repair. These three photographs I'm showing you on your screen just to illustrate. The top left is works having begun. They've stripped away all the ivy off the front facade. Bottom left is works rather seriously underway. In fact, it's looking a lot more like how it is today. And on the right is how you would see it today and how the Churchills knew it. This side looks largely cosmetic, however. Essentially, it's that Scottish baronial style gone and a much more simplified, in keeping with 1920 style frontage in its place. However, if you look at the other side, and here we have the facade of the house that faces that beautiful view. So here you have the top left, the house as it was in 1921, bottom left, works underway, and right as you see it. And from this one, you can see that actually it's not just a change to the aesthetic. This is a root and branch change of the house. There are entire wings of the house that are removed. There are parts that are extended. It's a really, really big project. So much so that it takes just under 2 years to make Chartwell into the home the Churchills wanted. In terms of cost, when they'd originally bought it for £5,000, they'd budgeted another 7 on its remodelling, which is actually, you know, that makes sense. Although it's a lot, it's the price of the house again and some to remodel it, but that's what they'd budgeted. So it would have been 12,000 in total. However, the works on the building itself cost £20,000. And then you've got the elements of the decorating and the furnishings and the fixtures and fittings and all of those elements, which come to another 10. So suddenly the house Churchill's bought for 5,000 has cost him 35,000. At this point, Winston Churchill commissions the valuation from an estate agent to see that it was hopefully worthwhile. And much to Churchill's horror, the price that the house came back as being worth at that point was just £12,000. And that's a fact that he rather wisely chose not to tell Clementine. So the Churchills move in, and here's a photograph of them in the mid-1920s, enjoying the dining room at Chartwell. However, these smiles do hide quite a lot. The house continued to have problems long after they had moved in. And that side of the house that faced the view, unfortunately, because it has this wonderful view, it has nothing shielding it from the elements. There is no buffer, there's no barrier. It gets the full force of British storms. And consequently, there are a number of times when, for example, the children's rooms have to be evacuated in the middle of the night because water is streaming down the walls. So you've got a house that isn't even cost-free once they've moved in, because all of these failings need to be addressed. But also you've got the fact that a house of Chartwell size needs a considerable staffing for its upkeep. So, for example, a house of this size, you're going to need a butler, you're going to need kitchen maids, you're going to need housemaids, you're going to need a lady's maid, you're going to need gardeners, handymen, secretaries. This is a really costly thing to have a house of this size. So with all these factors at play, Winston Churchill presents a list of 14 ways in which the Churchills need to urgently save money. He gives this list to his wife in 1926. And the list included things like renting out Chartwell when they were away, or selling all but 2 of their ponies, and a steer to reduce the frequency of guests. What might seem rather remarkable, given this extraordinary situation of Churchill's financially, is that he is by this point Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is the role in British politics at the helm of the British economy and finances. And he, by this point, has moved back to the Conservative Party. He had started with them in 1900 and was with them for 4 years before moving to the Liberals. And then in 1924, he crosses the floor back to the Conservatives. So that's who we're looking at now, a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer for the latter half of the 1920s. However, as was so often the case with Winston Churchill's political career, his fortunes, both literally and figuratively, would plummet by the end of the decade. A general election was called in May 1929, at which point Winston Churchill stood to retain his seat as Conservative Member of Parliament for the constituency of Epping. And he was successful. And here we can see in this photograph him having his hand shaken at the vote count. So he's delighted. However, his party, the Conservatives, are defeated. A Labour government is brought in. And so Winston Churchill is not only on the backbenches of Parliament, he's on the opposition benches as well. There is, however, something of a silver lining for Winston Churchill because suddenly he has more time on his hands. And you might remember that actually writing was always his main source of income, far more so than politics. So if he has more time, he can do more with his literary work. And one of the things he decides to do is to undertake a lecture tour of the United States in the aftermath of this election in 1929. Because by this point, he is already a well-regarded and highly sought-after speaker and lecturer. So he heads to the United States in the late summer of 1929, and he's there through into the autumn as well. Whilst he's in America, in the autumn of 1929, he gets bitten by the bug of speculating on the stock market. So you can probably all imagine that autumn of 1929 is probably the worst time in history to be speculating in stocks. And you would be absolutely right. Given Winston Churchill's already knife-edge finances at this point, it is perhaps a catastrophic event that the Wall Street crash results in Churchill losing, in today's money, the equivalent of around £1 million in one fell swoop. At this point, he has little choice. If he is going to keep his home, he needs to write, and he needs to write fast. Fortunately, it is very helpful that at this point he is commissioned to write a 4-volume history of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. For anyone who's not familiar with the Duke of Marlborough, he secured his place in British military history as a result of a series of victories in battles during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. So he is a hero in British military history, and Winston Churchill's commissioned to write this biography. And the advance for that book keeps him afloat financially. But this isn't just a project for income. This is him writing about his ancestor, and he wants to do him justice. So Winston Churchill takes the research very seriously. And as part of his research, he decides to visit the battlefields that his ancestor had fought on to get a feeling of the conflicts in which he had led battles. And it is as a result of this research that he finds himself in Germany in the summer of 1932. At this point, one of the most remarkable sliding doors moments in history takes place because there is a dinner scheduled whilst Winston Churchill is in Munich in August 32, in which Winston Churchill and his family are going to be joined for dinner by Adolf Hitler. Seems too remarkable for words. And perhaps as an illustration of Adolf Hitler's rather terrible judgment, though he initially accepts the invitation, when the time comes, he decides that Winston Churchill, now he's out of office, he's only a member of parliament, he's probably not going to be in government again, isn't worthy of his time. And so Adolf Hitler stands Winston Churchill up. So though the pair didn't meet on that fateful day in the summer of 1932, what Winston Churchill had witnessed during his time in Germany was enough to ring serious alarm bells. He came back to the UK, although was rather unwell upon his return. He'd contracted paratyphoid, which left him very, very weak and having to manoeuvre around Chartwell in a wheelchair for a couple of months actually after his return. But as soon as he could, in November of that year, he stood in Parliament and made his first speech warning about the Nazi threat. He said that he had witnessed a war mentality in Germany and that the young men he had seen marching on the streets weren't looking for status, they were looking for weapons. Throughout the 1930s, no matter who was in government, time and time again, Winston Churchill found himself amongst the most experienced of parliamentarians and yet forced to remain on the backbenches of Westminster. Chartwell became his place of exile, but its remote location would prove perfect for the purpose that it would hold over the coming years. Chartwell was to become Churchill's campaign headquarters against the Nazis, his Citadel, as I have named my book, and a term that was originally coined by one of his loyal and long-standing secretaries, from which he would tirelessly fight for the rest of that decade to sound the alarm that Nazi Germany were preparing for war. Over the following 7 years, Churchill invited countless visitors to Chartwell, many of whom were captured in Chartwell's visitors book, but quite a few of whom weren't, because there was a real risk to be seen to be feeding Winston Churchill information at this time. Some of the visitors were regulars over these years, and some of them were one-off visitors. So I thought for all of you this evening, I'd introduce you to a few of the protagonists. And as I mentioned, my book consists of 12 meetings, so I'm going to just spotlight a few of them for you this evening. The individual on the left, T.E. Lawrence, who history knows as Lawrence of Arabia, but by this point was going by the name of T.E. Shaw. He had changed his name as part of a desperate attempt to seek anonymity because he certainly didn't crave the worldwide fame that became his after the First World War. He would much prefer a private, quiet life, hence the name change. By this point, he is serving in the Royal Air Force, but he has had an earlier career working with Winston Churchill in Westminster. So that photograph I showed you at the very outset, when he was Secretary of State for the Colonies, he has T.E. Lawrence in his team in Westminster at that point. So they've known each other for a long time by the time of this meeting in 1934. But what Lawrence can bring is his particular insight into the Royal Air Force, because he's now working for them, he's in that camp, he understands the ways it works. And the conversation that happens at Chartwell at this point, and do bear in mind this is the very beginning of 1934, is Winston Churchill anticipating that if a future war were to break out, it probably wouldn't look like the First World War, which was dominated by trench warfare. Instead, it would probably have a greater propensity to play out in the skies because of the nature of technological development at that point in the interwar years. So the conversation Churchill has with Lawrence of Arabia at the dining room table at Chartwell is, how could you defend civilian populations in Britain in the event of aerial bombardment? This is Winston Churchill effectively predicting the Blitz. And I shan't give too much away, but it is a really remarkable moment to show Churchill's understanding of and his foresight into what likely awaited. And I should add as well, this is at a point when the First World War is still known as the war to end all wars. The vast majority of people can't even stomach the idea that another war could be on the horizon. Then we have Heinrich Brüning, who is a former Chancellor of Germany, who held that office from 1930 to 1932. So he holds that at the end of the Weimar government. He has, unfortunately, upon the ascendancy of Adolf Hitler, become a political opponent of the governing regime, and he is referenced by friends in Germany at that point in time, after Adolf Hitler's made Chancellor, as looking like a hunted animal, because he is essentially in hiding and fearing for his life. He flees from Germany and makes his way to England, and by this point, Winston Churchill, even in 1937, is one of the few people loudly vocalizing opposition to the Nazis in Germany. And so he has almost this gravitational pull for those who have the same perspective as him. So Heinrich Brüning comes to his house. And one of the things I love, and the very human things about these meetings, because at the moment it's all sounding very high politics, but I love the fact that Heinrich Brüning, on his first visit to Chartwell, later writes that it was the most drunk he had ever been in his entire life. So that certainly gives you a visual of what some of these meetings were like. But the truth be told, if you were someone who could potentially be a regular source of information and intelligence, Winston Churchill wanted you to feel welcome and content and at ease in his home. So you would come back time and time again. And that's exactly what happens with Heinrich Brüning, although he does seem to manage his alcohol intake on subsequent journeys. This visit in August 1937 sees Brüning bring a friend of his who stayed in Germany a little longer, a former cabinet minister of his former transport secretary, who tried to stay in Germany while the Nazis were in power. And unfortunately, he found himself a victim of the Night of the Long Knives, which, if any of you aren't familiar with it, it's a night in June 1934, which sees a very targeted purge on any of Hitler's opponents who remain in Germany. So a series of assassinations over one night. And so this good friend of Brüning's manages to flee, but genuinely only just. The Nazis turned up at his front door with their guns, and he managed to flee in a hail of bullets. So Heinrich Brüning is not only able to bring intelligence and information from his network still in Germany, he can bring individuals offering first-hand testimonies of the terror playing out in Germany. And these are accounts that aren't making their way to other senior political figures. It is because Chartwell is remote, and these people who are frightened but feel they can trust Churchill are able to disclose their experiences. The individual on the right, Sheila Grant Duff, is a distant cousin of Clementine's, who rather handily happens to be a foreign correspondent specialising in Czechoslovakia. You might note the date of this visit is October 1938. She does come a few times in the mid-1930s, but the particular chapter in focus is October 1938, which is just days after the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement takes place after a series of aggressive foreign policy moves by the Nazis. They have remilitarized the Rhineland, they have annexed Austria, and they are making moves to occupy the Sudetenland, which is a region of Czechoslovakia on the west side of the country. And thanks to Sheila Grant Duff, who is very popular in political circles in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, Churchill is then able to have essentially a direct line to the political leaders in Czechoslovakia and have direct insights into their thinking and their strategy in the face of Nazi aggression. And this information rather handily makes its way to Churchill's door at Chartwell, thanks to this cousin of Clementine's. There are also, of course, some one-off visitors, including the likes of Joseph P. Kennedy, who will be famous to, I'm sure, many people watching this evening, as the father of the future president, John F. Kennedy. The reason that this meeting takes place is because Kennedy is, at this point, rather good friends with President Roosevelt, and a mutual friend of Churchill's, who knows both of them, messages Churchill and says, Joe Kennedy is making his way to London, and I strongly suggest, if you want to befriend someone who has the ear of the president, that you invite Joseph Kennedy to your home. So Churchill does just that. And so Joe Kennedy and his wife Rose make their way to Chartwell one very rainy day in October. And what's interesting about this meeting is that Kennedy is used to, when he meets new people, the hosts being very effusive and sort of hanging on his every word. Whereas Churchill goes straight into campaign mode, and this instantly rubs up the Kennedys in the wrong way. It's not what they're used to. They're not used to a sort of almost confrontational meeting as a first encounter with someone. But the reason that Churchill takes this tone is because he is very alarmed and is desperately seeking help from the United States. And what he pitches to Kennedy, in the hope that Kennedy will relay this to Roosevelt, is some sort of shared Anglo-American naval police force to ensure security and peace across the seas. So you might be wondering, why on earth is Churchill pitching this in the mid-1930s? The reason being that just a few months earlier, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement has been signed. This agreement is astonishing on reflection because it was intended to allow Germany to rebuild its navy to a third the size of Britain's. However, the terms of the agreement were so convoluted that what was actually agreed was that Germany could rebuild its fleet to a third the size of British and Commonwealth fleets combined. So the British government were essentially giving the green light to Germany for massive naval expansion. And Churchill, having been First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, our last global conflict against Germany, was terrified by this prospect and hopeful that collective security with the United States would act as a deterrent for Adolf Hitler. However, this meeting does not go Churchill's way. The pair don't hit it off, and in fact, the relationship only worsens as the 1930s progresses between Winston Churchill and Joseph P. Kennedy. And the reason I've included this one is because actually, if all of Churchill's meetings went his way, he would have come to power and influence far sooner. So I wove this one in as an illustration of the challenges and obstructions that Winston Churchill faced when making his fight for awareness of the Nazi threat. The gentleman in the middle, Ewald von Kleist-Schmenzen, I think should be far better known than he is. He comes to Britain as a representative of a number of dissident German generals. Remarkably, there are a number of German generals who at this point in 1938 can see that war is on the horizon and don't want it. And they feel that there is the possibility of overthrowing Adolf Hitler. But they need something to give them the confidence to do so. And what Kleist-Schmenzen is tasked with doing on their behalf is coming to Britain and securing a series of letters from senior political figures. What these generals want is something in writing saying, if Germany invades Czechoslovakia, which it's looking increasingly likely will happen at this point, that England will declare war on Germany. If letters can be gathered from political figures to this effect, the generals will feel empowered to overthrow Adolf Hitler. So this gentleman, Kleist-Schmenzen, is genuinely on a mission where his life is at risk in trying to secure these letters. He meets with Winston Churchill, and Churchill completely agrees. He says, I think that this is definitely the case, that we should declare war. However, I am only a member of parliament and I'm not in government and don't have say on foreign policy. But I will nonetheless write you a letter saying what I think should happen. Unfortunately, the well had already been poisoned against Kleist-Schmenzen in terms of political circles in London, with the likes of our then Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, declaring, I have heard of this man and he is not to be trusted. So Kleist-Schmenzen goes back with a handful of letters, including Churchill's, but this isn't enough to persuade the generals to feel confident enough to overthrow Hitler. And so this remarkable moment where the entire Second World War could have been averted is lost. And not only that, Kleist-Schmenzen, unfortunately, does suffer the repercussions when Nazi troops search his home and find the letter on headed paper from Chartwell from Winston Churchill. The last of these one-off visitors I'm going to highlight for you this evening is Kuo Tai-chi. He is the Chinese ambassador in London who visits just a few weeks before the outbreak of war. And in a nutshell, this meeting is remarkable because you have a situation where China has been subject to a full-scale invasion by Japan for 2 years by this point. Although war hasn't been declared, they are both operating under the conditions of war. And so you have the Chinese ambassador coming on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek, the head of the Chinese government, wanting Churchill's ear. Churchill isn't in government, and yet you have heads of government trying to have a direct line to him. So I think that's really interesting to show just how much the situation had changed over the 1930s, where Churchill had been this lone voice ostracized at the outset to people really manoeuvring for his ear by the end of the decade. As part of my research as well, I was able to have access to some phenomenal archives, and part of what I yielded was access to some rare and never-before-seen photographs, which then feature in the book. These include the likes of this astonishing image of Churchill and Albert Einstein in the garden at Chartwell in 1933. Einstein visiting because he has fled from Germany by this point. There is a price on his head, and he is genuinely fearing for his life. And because by this point, right at the start of the decade, Churchill really is the only person speaking out against Nazi Germany, Albert Einstein visits his home to relay what he has witnessed in Germany. Sorry, do forgive me. The individual on the right Stefan Laurent, he is the editor of the Picture Post publication. He's previously been editor of a newspaper in Germany called the Munich Illustrated Press, but that publication was in opposition to the Nazis, and he quickly found himself arrested as a political prisoner. He is released after a few months because he is a Hungarian citizen, and the Hungarian embassy get involved and negotiate his release. So when he has fled to England and sets up this extraordinarily widespread and widely read publication, he wants to platform Winston Churchill. And the reason this meeting is so important is because in due course, when Winston Churchill is appointed Prime Minister in May 1940, and we mustn't forget there wasn't an election in 1940, he was simply appointed. The reason that the transition was so smooth, Churchill credited to the likes of Stefan Laurent having helped get his message out in the months before war broke out. So as well as these very important, monumental, high-pressure geopolitical discussions, I should say that Chartwell and, well, Churchill Citadel is the story of a family home. So you also have the day-to-day lives and dramas that play out of a family happening alongside these events of high politics. I was very fortunate that the Churchill family gave me extraordinary access to things like photo albums. And so this is a page of Mary's photo album from around this time, Mary being the daughter born on the day Churchill made the offer on Chartwell. So you have images from sort of this very pastoral, idyllic scene on the left, Mary with her two pet goats, Millie and Molly. And the wall you see behind her is part of the very extensive brick walls Churchill built at Chartwell. On the right, we have Sarah, the middle daughter. Her story really comes to the fore during the abdication crisis, when Edward VIII wants to marry Wallis Simpson. And whilst Churchill is dealing with this extraordinarily difficult situation, the greatest constitutional crisis in British history, Sarah has eloped to be with a man that Winston doesn't approve of, who's living in New York. And so there's headlines around the world of Churchill's daughter runs away, and he's got that on his mind at the same time he's trying to stop the British monarchy from collapsing. So you also get an insight into genuinely what is on Churchill's plate at this point. I'm also delighted to have been able to spotlight the roles of the staff at Chartwell, because it is my belief that their lives orbited around Chartwell just as much as the Churchills did. So, for example, you have Grace Hamlin shown here on the left, who was a secretary of the Churchills for this entire period. And with, she came up with the Churchill Citadel idea. So I owe her my thanks. And on the right, we have a wonderful image of Churchill's head gardener, but also the little girl in his arms, his daughter, is still alive. And I've been able to not only interview her a lot for this book, she's also become a good friend as well. And she was able to offer insights into things like the Churchills' kind of staff Christmas parties and all that sort of really rich social history for the staff at Chartwell. And just before I conclude for you all this evening, I'm going to show you one of my favourite insights in terms of research discoveries that I feel like is a metaphor for the whole book. This photograph was in the archives of Getty, but it had never been developed. So I pleaded with the team there to develop it, but I thought there must be a reason this hasn't been developed. It's probably the case that he's blinking or it's blurry or something like that. And when it was developed, it was just this most wonderful image. Churchill with the hat, with the cane, cigar in hand, cheeky grin, and the home that meant so much to him behind him. So I was able to unearth this lost gem, lost to time since 1939, and bring it to get the spotlight it deserves. And so it's from the depths of more archives than I can count and 4 years of research and writing that Churchill's Citadel came. My ambition at the outset was to shift Chartwell in the narrative from a scenic backdrop to events to centre stage in what I believe was amongst the most significant chapters in Churchill's life. It is my belief that the meetings held at Chartwell were vital to his return to government upon Britain's declaration of war in 1939. And therefore, without these meetings, Britain may well have been denied his era-defining leadership and the courage and determination over the course of his wartime premiership that took Britain from the brink of defeat to victory. And so that is Churchill's Citadel. So I will stop sharing my screen at this point. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Catherine. There was an absolutely fascinating talk there. Wonderful insight into Chartwell, into Churchill in the 1930s, and into your process of writing this book. To everyone listening in this evening on this side of the pond, this afternoon on the other side of the pond, this is that opportunity you've got now to send some questions in and ask Catherine any questions you might have. If you want to do that, use the chat function, chuck your questions in there, and I'll pass them on to Catherine in a moment's time. But as we wait for you to do that. If you'll let me, Catherine, I think I'll get the ball rolling with a question. And one of the things that always interests me with a book like this is sort of where it comes from ultimately. And I just wondered if you could give us a sense. Is this sort of was there a kind of an epiphanal moment where you thought this is the book I need to write, or is it more of a slow burn? Where does this book come from originally?
Well, the conversation began with my publisher, with Yale University Press, in 2020. And it was that moment when COVID had hit, and it was a very strange time. We were all in our homes more. And I began to think, okay, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. And it had long been a belief in my mind that Chartwell was underrepresented in terms of the histories of Winston Churchill's life. Like I said, it was this kind of, place of relaxation. And I thought, if I don't tell this story, no one will, because, there was things like that photograph of Churchill with Einstein, and no one ever seemed to question why he was there. It was just like this fun fact of, did you know Albert Einstein visited Chartwell? Well, why? What was the conversation? What was the context? And so, if anything, I'm astonished that no one else had written this book sooner. I'm delighted no one else had written this book sooner, because I'm extremely proud of it. But it simply was the case that there was so much evidence that had never been unearthed or had the spotlight it deserved. And so I thought I should do it.
And what comes through really strongly in the book as well, and you gave us a sense of that when you were talking there, is quite how much wonderfully rich material you've been able to draw on for this book. And I'm guessing that as curator of Chartwell, that's been a really useful insider route into accessing some of that material. So much of this is the archive there at Chartwell.
Well, actually, it's funny you say that. Chartwell doesn't have an archive per se. Chartwell has 9,000 objects, but they pertain to things like his book collection and furniture and paintings and that sort of thing. The main repository of archives related to Winston Churchill is at the Churchill Archive Centre at Churchill College in Cambridge. So that was a brilliant source. And the visitor's book at Chartwell, which is an object there, but one can, explore the pages to research. But even then, that only listed the people who signed the visitors book. It wasn't 100% of visitors. And in fact, sometimes the most interesting people were the ones who were worried about signing it and didn't. So my research took me everywhere, from the likes of Bruning's archive is at Harvard, the former chancellor. Sheila Grant Duff, a lot of her archive is at the Bodleian in Oxford. For Quo Tai Chi's visit, I had to go to the National Archives. So it was a real mix, but then enriched by the likes of oral history interviews with the secretaries and letters from, Clementine to her daughter, describing what had happened. There was many different threads, but I think that's together created this really rich tapestry as a result.
Fantastic. That's wonderful, Catherine. We've got a couple of questions in. I'll just correct myself because I think I said throw your questions into the chat, but throw them into the question and answer function that you can see on Zoom there. And we've got a couple of questions here. So Stephen asks if you could say a little bit more about Churchill's relationship with the architect who did so much of that kind of large scale and expensive renovation work. I imagine that was a quite close relationship.
Um, would I say close? It was an intense relationship, certainly. So this architect had worked on a number of houses of people that Churchill knew, including David Lloyd George, for example. So people whose opinions he trusted. This is a good architect. And I think the problems quickly arose because the nature of the failings of Chartwell spiraled very, very quickly. And not only that, Winston Churchill was a very present client. He, for those 2 years of works, hired a house down the road about a mile and a half away and was very, very present on site. Philip Tilden, who is the architect in question, remembered later that Churchill made more than 100 site visits during the duration of those works, which he wasn't used to. He was used to being pretty trusted and left to it, but Churchill was just there all the time, making observations. Things weren't how he wanted, and so on. And also, from the outset, Churchill had this image of a relationship like the like with Blenheim Palace, where Blenheim Palace initially was this big three-dimensional model that was presented to him. And so Churchill wanted one of these from the architect, and the architect went, well, no, we don't need one, just drawings is fine. And they just worked very differently. So by the end, it was a pretty sour relationship. And actually, as you can imagine, that worsened even more so once the Churchills were moved in and problems continued. But the truth is that there's just issues with a house on that site generally. To this day, we have to do things like replace the oak subframes of the windows because of the amount of water that hits them. So I think, unfortunately, Churchill probably would have had difficulties with whatever architect, but it was exacerbated by differences in character.
As you say, that's an intense relationship there.
Yeah.
Visson asks if you could say something about the role of Chartwell during the war itself. Did it continue to play an important function, or was it a little bit supplanted by the fact he's in Downing Street in Westminster?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm so glad you've asked it because it's a lovely thing to cover. First of all, for any of you who do find yourselves buying Churchill Citadel, I should say that the epilogue of the book carries on into the war and outlines what happens to each of the protagonists once war breaks out. And Chartwell almost feels like another character in this book. So I do take the story of Chartwell into the epilogue of Churchill Citadel. There is instantly concerns that Chartwell is likely a target for the German Luftwaffe. And that proves to be a correct assertion because the Nazis created this document called the Black Book, which listed the residences to send troops to upon the successful invasion of Britain to either arrest or assassinate the occupants. And Chartwell is in that book. So yes, the Nazis knew full well where he was. Not only that, Chartwell sits in a part of Kent known as Bomb Alley, because if you are flying from Germany across the Channel towards London, your flight path just takes you rather handily over that part of Kent. And so any German Luftwaffe that hadn't dropped their bombs over London, in order to be more fuel efficient on the way home, would just sporadically drop their bombs over Kent. So it was incredibly risky place to be, even if it wasn't Churchill's home. So with all that in mind, you might be thinking, gosh, it's even more astonishing, how did Chartwell survive? And how is it that Catherine has a workplace to go to every day? And the reason being that Chartwell from above is very distinct. It's a T-shaped building with two very large lakes. And so Churchill has this brilliant idea that if he covers one of the lakes with a net, covers that net with leaves, suddenly it's a T-shaped house with one lake. And for that reason, the Nazis never successfully identify Chartwell. And so that's how it survives the war. Oh, and I should say, in terms of Churchill's time there, he came back a few times to Chartwell, but because he couldn't be sure that his plan would work, that's the main reason he wasn't there more during the war, because it was essentially a target for the Nazis. So it would be too high risk for him to be there a lot.
Understood, understood. A follow-on question from this, a little bit in some respects, anyway, from Lucy, just asking if you could explain to us how close is Chartwell to London, especially in kind of 1930s terms. How long does it take to get from central London to Chartwell by road or by rail?
If you were driving to London, and I should say that this was a factor in Churchill's decision making because all of us consider the commute to work when we're buying a house. So that was definitely in his mind. At that point in 1921-22, when he was considering it, you could have driven from Chartwell to Westminster in under an hour. I can confirm that it is not less than an hour anymore. It's considerably more than that. So that's how long it would have taken. So it was feasible for Churchill to easily go to London and back at that point in time.
Whilst also offering him that sense of escape, I guess, as well, especially because of its beautiful rural location.
Definitely, yeah. Chartwell is 2 miles from the nearest village, so it's not even got anywhere on its doorstep. It really does feel like you are miles from anywhere, which for Winston Churchill was absolutely perfect.
Yeah, yeah. You were talking when you were speaking a while ago about Clementine and that relationship. And Carol asks if you could say, tell us something about Clementine's roles during these meetings that Churchill was having with these various visitors. Did she have a particular role that she played in these encounters?
So she would be heavily involved, but beyond the encounter itself. So say, for example, one of the chapters I didn't mention tonight, but is Pierre Flandin, who is a former French Prime Minister, who rather handily is feeding Churchill French estimates of German military preparedness during this time.
Ah.
So, for example, at this point, Clementine first of all, she's fluent in French rather handily, so she can play that role if need be. But also she will be involved in things like the planning of the menus. So, there will be very, very careful efforts. I came up with the phrase dinner table diplomacy, which is the making sure that all the stars align so these people feel maximum at home and comfortable and catered to. So, for example, she will make sure that for a very important visitor, that a cook is sort of brought in, especially because their finances were so tight, they didn't have a permanent high standard cook, but they could bring them in for individual instances. So hiring in a cook, what cuisine will this person like? Professor Lindemann, who's a regular at this point, is a vegetarian, for example. So if there's any vegetarians at the table, factoring that in. So she's doing a lot of the planning and coordinating and, maneuvering beforehand, so that once they're all around this table, it can go as much in Churchill's way as possible. So she really is, extraordinarily important from start to finish and beyond with these meetings.
Ah, wonderful. And I love that phrase there, dinner table diplomacy. And a sort of a follow-on question to that one from Stephen asking the role that Chartwell plays here as a centre of kind of Churchill's diplomatic endeavours, is that unusual for a country house in 1930s England, or is this something replicated at other similar sites and involving other politicians of this age as well? That kind of role of the country house as a court, as a place of diplomacy.
Really good question. So there are certainly country houses that form as locuses for gatherings. There's a wonderful phrase, some houses are known as party houses, where you'd have all these kind of decadent gatherings. So sometimes it was that, sometimes it was, fun and frivolity. There were a number of houses where politicians would gather, but I think that none of them had the level of international importance arising from events there compared with Chartwell. Chartwell's often called the most important country house in Europe, and I think that name is very deserved.
Mm. I think we've got time for just a couple more. Mark asks if, in the course of your research, anything came out in terms of the role and the place of faith in Winston Churchill's activities in these meetings. Is that something you encountered in the sources you've been working through?
Interestingly, Winston Churchill doesn't reference God a great deal in his own writings about this time, but there are, for example, moments where Mary, his daughter, recalled him proclaiming at the dinner table one night, I swear to God, I do not hope for war. Because a lot of people were kind of indicating that Churchill was kind of squaring up because he loved war. Whereas, truth be told, his efforts to maintain armaments or ensure collective security through alliances were him trying to deter war. But he made the sort of proclamation of I swear to God. So there are moments when it comes out, it just doesn't tend to be reflected in his own writings as much. And there's a quote of Churchill's once where he said, "I'm not so much a pillar of the church as a flying buttress," which I which I think is a rather wonderful thing, sort of still part of it, but maybe sort of supporting from the outside.
Churchill, the writer, and of course also the artist. And Shabra asks, she's curious as to whether one of those paintings behind you are either of those a Churchill.
So they are, they're replicas, I confess. So it is now 7:30 in the evening here in the UK, and so I'm not at my desk at Chartwell, I should say. But these are both reproductions. This one is a reproduction of a painting Churchill did of Chartwell, and the one above it, which you can only just see a little bit of, is a reproduction of one in Italy. For any of you who are able to make it to Chartwell, though, Chartwell does have the largest collection of Churchill paintings on public display. It has 169, which is about a third of Churchill's output over the course of his life. So well worth a visit, even just for the paintings.
Fantastic. I'm gonna take chair's prerogative and ask our last question if I can. And it's got to be: is there going to be a book two, Catherine? Is there a new plan at work, or is it far too early for me to be asking that?
Well, I'm definitely still feeling very much immersed in book one. But the reception to the first book, Churchill Citadel, has been so overwhelmingly positive that my publisher, Yale University Press, are keen for me to consider the follow-ups. My inclination actually is to maybe do a prequel. So a lot of the information I covered in the sort of, giving context, that is only done in a nutshell in the book. But those years where he's chancellor, you know, there are secret meetings that happen at Chartwell then during the general strike, which are really interesting. It's the years when he's crossing the floor from the Liberals to Conservatives, so the conversations happening around that. It's also the time when his family are younger, so his daughters are being presented as debutantes at court, so very Bridgerton. So it's a really interesting chapter, and again one that's had remarkably little scholarship from historians. So my thinking is maybe head back a little bit to the '20s.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. If you do, we shall have to have you back, Catherine, to talk to us about that because that sounds really interesting. We're out of time, everybody, so I'm going to wrap things up now. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Catherine once again for her fascinating talk. If you haven't yet bought or read the book, then do so. I've read it myself. All of the praise and the acclaim is richly deserved. It's a fascinating read, brilliantly weaving together high politics and the domestic stories of Chartwell, as Catherine has also done in this evening's talk. You can catch it again on YouTube if you want, and if you want to check in with the seminars that we gave last year, you can also see those on YouTube. We shall be back in the spring with our next seminar on this theme of alliances. Details to follow, so keep an eye out there on the Sulgrave Manor website and also on our social media presence. If you want to make a donation to Sulgrave at all, because we're a charity and we appreciate all your support, then you can check out the information to do so on our website as well. Finally, let me just thank a couple of colleagues at Sulgrave Manor, Alison Ray and Samantha Jackson, for their support behind the scenes in producing and running this evening's seminar. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you again, Catherine, and we'll see you again for book 2 in a short while's time, a couple of years' time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Sam, and thank you everyone for joining this evening.
Thanks, Catherine. Bye, everyone.